Jason Whitfield had always felt like an outsider. Growing up, he was the quiet kid, the one who spent more time in his head than with others. School had been a blur of passing faces, and though he had friends, he never truly felt seen. He preferred the solace of his room, where the outside world seemed like an abstract concept. He had a small group of friends, but even then, he kept his distance, never really allowing anyone to get too close. His parents had always been distant, especially after his father left when Jason was just 13. That's when he learned to take care of himself, finding solace in late-night TV shows and books. The world beyond the pages was more real to him than the one he inhabited. When he turned 18, he left home and found a job at Valley Mart, a 24-hour grocery store. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay the rent on a small apartment he could barely afford in a run-down part of the city. He chose the night shift. Something about the late hours felt familiar, as though the dead of night gave him the space to breathe. During the day, the world was alive, full of noise and people. At night, he could hide in the shadows and not be seen, just like he preferred. However, over the past year of working the shift, something had shifted. Jason had begun to notice things: the lights flickering in the aisles, the strange noises that echoed when the store was empty, the unexplainable cold that seemed to settle in certain corners of the store. At first, he dismissed them as nothing more than the result of a tired mind, the product of too many sleepless nights. But over time, the oddities grew. It started with the small things: a can falling from the shelf when no one was around, or the strange feeling of being watched when there was no one else in the store. Now, on this particular night, the store felt different. It was as if the air had thickened, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The dim fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, flickering occasionally. Jason tried to shake the feeling, but the weight of it seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He took a deep breath, trying to distract himself by focusing on his phone. But as his eyes flicked back and forth, he noticed something: a shadow. At first, he thought it was just his tired eyes playing tricks on him, but when he glanced up again, it was still there, looming at the end of the aisle, a dark figure, barely visible in the low light. Jason felt his heartbeat quicken, but he pushed it down. "It's just the shadows," he muttered to himself. "It's just the way the light falls. No big deal." Still, the feeling wouldn't leave him. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and decided to take a walk through the aisles. Maybe the movement would shake off the strange sensation. As Jason wandered through the aisles, something caught his eye. A small section of the store was dedicated to old, dusty items, items that had been here longer than the store itself. They weren't for sale, just strange knickknacks and forgotten merchandise shoved in the back. There was a box of old VHS, tapes, stacks of decaying magazines, and several faded photographs framed on the walls. He'd never noticed them before. As he reached for an old, tattered photograph, the air seemed to grow colder. The photo was black and white, showing a man standing in front of what appeared to be the original Valley Mart building, a much smaller, run-down establishment. The man in the photograph was wearing an old apron and had a far-off, almost mournful look in his eyes. Jason squinted at the name scrawled at the bottom, Howard Hargrove. The name didn't ring a bell, but there was something unsettling about the look on his face. He turned the photo over and found more scribbled words in pencil. They can't leave. None of them can leave. Jason's skin prickled. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but his instincts screamed at him to leave the back room. As he set the photograph back, the lights overhead flickered again, followed by a sudden drop in temperature that made his breath catch in his throat. He rubbed his arms, trying to ward off the creeping cold, and then heard something that made the hair on his neck stand on end. A voice. At first, it was so soft he couldn't make it out, but then, as if the voice was pulling him in, it grew louder. Jason, Jason, you're here. Come closer. Jason froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around the back room, but saw no one. His breath fogged in front of him, ATE, sign that the temperature had dropped drastically, far colder than it should have been. The voice echoed again, only this time it was closer, right behind him. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He turned, heart racing, only to find nothing. The room was empty, but the whisper didn't stop. It felt like it was coming from all directions now. The walls, the shelves, the very air around. Him seemed to vibrate with the same name. Jason! Jason! We've been waiting for you. Jason stumbled backward, his pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random occurrence. It was deliberate. His eyes darted around the back room again, and that's when he noticed it. On the floor, etched into the wood, were strange symbols. Symbols that looked like they had been carved over time, worn and faded, but still visible in the dim light. They seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, drawing him closer. Before he could investigate further, a loud bang rang out from the far end of the store. Jason whipped around, startled. Was someone there? The noise sounded like it came from the stockroom, but no one should have been back there. Reluctantly, Jason walked toward the source of the sound, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the store. As he neared the stockroom, the faintest of shapes moved past the doorway. Something dark, too fast for his eyes to fully process. His breath caught in his throat. The whispering had stopped, but Jason's instincts told him something far worse was coming. He pushed open the door to the stockroom, the handle cold beneath his fingers. The stockroom was a mess of old boxes and crates, filled with things the store didn't need. Shelves lined the walls, with piles of forgotten stock strewn haphazardly across the floor. Jason stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. The faint smell of mildew and dust filled the air. Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, one of the crates had been knocked over, its contents spilled across the floor. The crate was old, wooden and chipped with age, and as Jason approached, he noticed something odd. The crate was empty. All the cans and items that had once been inside were scattered across the floor in a disordered mess. But something else caught his attention. A shape moved in the far corner, just out of view. He wasn't imagining it. He could see it. A shadow, a fleeting figure that seemed to vanish every time he tried to focus on it. He stepped closer, his heart in his throat, until crash! The sound came from behind him. Jason spun around, his heart racing. From the darkness of the back room, a figure emerged, pale, hunched, with dark, hollow eyes. It was the woman from the photograph. No, it couldn't be. Jason's vision blurred for a moment, and the air around him seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. And then he saw it. A line of shadows stretching across the room, crawling up the walls, gathering toward him like a living thing. They whispered his name, growing louder and louder, until the room seemed to vibrate with the force of their collective voices. Jason! Jason! You can't leave. You can never leave. Jason's body moved before his mind could catch up. He stumbled backward, but the shadows surged forward, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He gasped for air. His hands scrambled for purchase on the shelves around him, but they were slick with something wet. He turned, and through the chaos of noise and shadow, saw that the shadows were no longer just whispering. They were reaching for him. The whispering turned into guttural growls. Jason stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as the shadows advanced. The cold air pressed down on him like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. He could feel the presence of something behind him, something vast and ancient, as though the very walls of the store were alive. He turned, eyes wide, looking for a way out. But every aisle seemed to stretch on forever, growing longer and longer until they all merged into a single, endless hallway of darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The floor beneath him felt sticky, as if something unseen was trying to hold him in place. His feet felt glued to the floor. He tried to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. All he could do was stare as the shadows gathered, their shapes becoming more distinct. The woman, no, the figure, was closer now. She was dragging herself toward him, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her mouth opening wider and wider with each movement, her jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and Jason felt a wave of terror flood through him, paralyzing him. "Jason," she whispered, her voice like a death rattle, cold and oppressive. "You've been chosen. You cannot leave." Jason's chest tightened, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air out of him. He fought against the sensation, but it was futile. The store had him now. He could feel it, a heavy weight pressing down on his soul. There was nowhere to go. He thought back to the old photograph he had found earlier, the one with Howard Hargrove, the man whose name was scrawled on the back with the cryptic message. Was he the store's first victim? Was this curse that Jason had stumbled upon something that had been festering for decades? His mind raced. He had to get out. But how? Jason's mind flashed back to a conversation he had overheard months ago between two employees, both older men who had worked at the store for as long as he had been alive. They had been whispering about the history of Valley Mart, something Jason had never given much thought to. But now, the pieces began to fit together. The store had opened in the early 1970s, founded by Howard Hargrove, a man who had once been a successful businessman but had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the grand opening. It was said that Howard had been a recluse, rarely seen outside the store except when dealing with suppliers. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic, and some of the town's older residents spoke in hushed tones about his growing obsession with something hidden beneath the store. As the whispers grew louder among the employees, Jason had caught bits and pieces of the story. They said that Howard had been trying to bring something back, though no one ever clarified exactly what that meant. All they knew was that soon after, the strange occurrences began. The lights flickered for no reason. Items moved by themselves. People started disappearing. Employees and customers alike would vanish without a trace, their bodies never found. But the most chilling part of the tale was the rumor that Howard had never truly left the store. His spirit was bound to it, trapped by a dark ritual he had performed in a desperate bid to gain eternal life. The ritual had gone wrong, and now the store was cursed, with the souls of the missing trapped inside it. Jason had laughed it off as a creepy legend, until now. The woman, if she could even be called that, was now within arm's reach. Her ragged clothes brushed against Jason's skin as she reached for him. Her fingers were cold, so cold that it felt like they were freezing his very bones. He shuddered as her breath, wet and rancid, brushed his ear. You can't escape. You never could." Jason's breath hitched as her words seeped into his mind, like a dark poison that paralyzed him from the inside. The shadows surged forward, engulfing him completely. The store itself seemed to exhale, as if it was alive, its cold, damp breath rolling over him, suffocating him in its grip. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could feel the floor beneath him shifting, as though it was giving way to some unseen abyss below. The aisles, once familiar, now seemed like an endless labyrinth, stretching impossibly far into the darkness. And in that darkness, he saw shapes moving. More of them, more figures, twisted and grotesque. The faces of those who had vanished long ago. Their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed on him, unblinking. They reached for him, crawling out from the shelves, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. Jason was surrounded, trapped in the store with no way out. His mind raced as he realized the truth. He wasn't alone here. He had never truly been alone. The store had taken him. The shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it. The store was alive, and it fed on the souls of the lost. The cold seemed to grow more intense with each passing moment, and Jason's thoughts were becoming clouded. He felt himself sinking into a daze, his vision flickering. He was no longer sure if he was awake or if this was all some horrible dream. Was he losing his mind? Was this all just a figment of his exhausted mind playing tricks on him? But then he remembered. He remembered the old photograph, the cryptic message on the back. They can't leave. None of them can leave. Jason's heart clenched. It wasn't just a curse. It was a prison. The store was a prison for the souls of the lost, and once you entered, you could never escape. The realization hit him with a gut-wrenching force. He had been chosen, just like all those before him, just like the others who had disappeared over the years. Jason was now part of the store's twisted cycle, a cycle that never ended. Jason! The woman's voice was softer now, almost like a lullaby, but there was no comfort in it. You belong here, just like the rest of us. You'll never leave. None of us will. Jason collapsed to his knees, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but it was no use. The shadows surrounded him, crawling over his body, suffocating him with their cold touch. His breath grew shallow as the darkness closed. In and then, suddenly, there was a sharp sound, a door slamming open. Jason's head snapped up. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. He could barely make out the details of the person, but they were there, moving toward him. The shadows recoiled at the presence of this new figure, almost as though they feared it. The figure spoke, their voice calm, but with an undeniable power. You have to make a choice, Jason. Jason could barely focus on the figure, his mind foggy and his vision swimming. The person in the doorway seemed to glow, their silhouette sharp against the darkness, as though they were an anomaly in this twisted reality. "Who are you?" Jason managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped forward into the dim light. Jason could make out the features now. A man, tall and weathered, with eyes that seemed to burn with intensity. He wore a tattered jacket, something old-fashioned, and a strange aura surrounded him. "I was once like you," the man said softly. His voice had an edge of both familiarity and sorrow. "I was here, but I made a choice. I fought back." Jason's mind raced. "What do you mean, a choice?" The man stepped closer, and Jason saw it clearly now. The man's eyes were filled with a strange mix of regret and determination. "The Pui store takes you in, but it doesn't control you unless you let it. You can break the curse if you're strong enough." Jason's head spun. Break the curse? But how? How could he possibly fight the store? Something that had already consumed so many others. "You have to make a sacrifice," the man continued. "A part of you will have to stay. Forever." Jason's heart stopped. "A sacrifice?" The figure nodded, gravely. "A part of your soul, your humanity, something you hold dear. If you choose to leave, it must remain behind, anchored to this place. It's the price for breaking the cycle." Jason's thoughts were a blur. The shadows were closing in again, and the air around him seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. The woman's voice echoed in his mind once more. "You can't leave." But the man, this stranger, was offering him a chance. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Could Jason make the ultimate sacrifice? Could he walk away from everything he knew, knowing that a piece of him would forever remain behind? Jason's breath was shallow, his heart pounding as the stranger stood before him. A dark figure bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The shadows that had closed in around Jason seemed to hesitate, recoiling as if wary of the man. Jason could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant echoes of the store's restless whispers. "Who are you?" Jason croaked, his voice barely audible over the cold that seemed to settle into his bones. The stranger paused, his eyes fixed on Jason with a kind of sorrowful understanding. "My name is Alexander," he said, his voice low and resonant, as though the words carried an ancient weight. "And I was once like you." Jason's eyes widened. "Like me? You mean you were trapped here too?" The man nodded, his gaze never leaving. Jason's, "Yes, I was a night shift worker just like you. Long ago, when this place was just a humble grocery store, I thought I could escape, but I wasn't strong enough. At first." Jason could feel his pulse quicken. "Escape? You mean you got out?" Alexander's expression softened with regret. "I did, but at a terrible cost. I was able to break the curse, temporarily. But it doesn't last. The store always pulls you back. Jason shook his head, confusion clouding his thoughts. How can I trust you? How do I know you're not just another part of this nightmare? The stranger took a step closer, his eyes dark with sorrow. I'm not the store, he said, his voice firm. But I am bound to it. I can never leave. I made my choice, and it wasn't easy. The curse that holds this place, it's not just for the souls trapped here. It tries to pull in anyone who works the night shift. It feeds on your fear, your despair. Jason's mind reeled. So, what's the choice? What do I have to do? Alexander's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. To leave, you must sever your connection to the store. You must sacrifice something vital, something irreplaceable. He hesitated, then continued. A part of your soul, a part of your very humanity. Jason's stomach lurched. A part of my soul? That's insane. What happens if I don't? What happens if I just leave now? The man shook his head slowly. The store will claim you. Forever. It will twist your mind, erase your memories, and trap you in an endless cycle of suffering. You will never leave. You'll become another, part of its twisted reality, another shadow among the others. Jason's chest tightened, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he truly give up part of himself to escape? What did that even mean? Was there even a choice? The shadows around him continued to writhe, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, urging him to give in to the darkness. Jason could feel his sanity slipping. His mind swirled with visions of the store, of the countless aisles that stretched on forever, the cold, indifferent walls that closed in around him, the voices of the lost souls who had once worked here. He could feel their presence all around, him pressing in from all sides, whispering in his ears, "Jason, Jason." The voices murmured, a chorus of sorrowful whispers. You can't escape. You're one of us now. Jason wanted to scream, but the words died in his throat. The presence of the store, the malevolent force that had consumed so many before him, was suffocating. He could feel its cold fingers creeping up his spine, trying to drag him deeper into its clutches. Please, he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if pleading for someone to save him. I don't want to stay. I don't want to be part of this. Alexander's expression softened, his eyes full of a pain that Jason could feel in his very bones. You must understand, Jason. The store feeds on fear, on loss. It will never let you go unless you sever that bond. You must be willing to leave behind a piece of yourself, the part that keeps you human, the part that anchors you to the world outside. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. The shadows seemed to grow darker around him, swirling like a storm. He could feel the oppressive weight of the store pressing in on him from every side. His mind felt foggy, as though it were slipping away into the darkness. What did it even mean to sacrifice a part of yourself? Was it worth it? Was his soul worth the chance of freedom? He thought of his life before Valley Mart, the life that seemed so distant now, the friends he had lost touch with, his family that he rarely spoke to anymore. But even that life felt like a fading memory. What was left of him, really? Jason looked up at the stranger. If I leave, what happens to me? To my mind? My memories? Alexander's eyes were filled with an understanding that Jason couldn't quite place. If you choose to leave, you will lose a part of yourself, a part that keeps you tethered to the world you know. But you will be free of this place. You will no longer be a prisoner. Jason's heart raced. He could feel the weight of his choice bearing down on him. Was he strong enough to sever his humanity? Could he survive without it? Was the price too high? Jason took a step forward, trembling. He could hear the whispers now, louder than ever. They were in his ears, in his mind, suffocating him with their unrelenting voices. The shadows were creeping closer, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He could feel the store trying to pull him back, trying to drag him into its endless maze. The walls seemed to close in, the aisles stretching further, the shelves towering higher. The cold was unbearable, and the whispers grew louder and louder until they were deafening. Jason's thoughts were a blur. He closed his eyes, struggling to focus. Could he do this? Could he leave? He thought about his life, his regrets, his fears. He thought about the people he had once known, the things he had once cared about. But none of it seemed real anymore. Everything felt like a distant dream, a fading memory. And then, as if out of nowhere, a voice broke through the noise. It was his own voice, clear and steady, rising above the chaos. I am not this place. The words echoed in his mind, a declaration of defiance. Jason opened his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. He wasn't going to let the store define him. He wasn't going to let it consume him. I choose to leave, Jason whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The stranger nodded solemnly, as though he had been expecting this. Then you must give up your humanity, Jason. Let go of what binds you. Jason's breath caught in his throat. Could he do it? Could he truly sever that part of himself? The part that made him human? But he had made his choice. He couldn't stay here any longer. The store had already taken too much from him. With a deep breath, Jason closed his eyes again, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He reached deep inside himself, grasping for that thread of humanity that connected him to the world he once knew. And then he let it go. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as if a part of him had been ripped away. A sharp, searing pain that made him gasp. The darkness around him seemed to recoil, the shadows faltering. For a moment, Jason felt lighter, as though something heavy had been lifted from his chest. The oppressive cold began to fade. When he opened his eyes, the store was no longer the same. The aisles had returned to their familiar shape. The shelves no longer seemed to stretch endlessly. The whispers were gone. The shadows had retreated. Jason looked up at Alexander, his body trembling but his mind clear. "I did it." The stranger gave him a sad, knowing smile. "You made the right choice, Jason. You are free." The store was quiet now, eerily so. Jason felt the weight of his decision pressing on him, but he knew it was the right one. As he turned toward the door, ready to leave the cursed place behind, he heard a voice. This time, not from the shadows, but from inside himself. "Remember, you can never come back." Jason didn't look back. He stepped through the door, into the night, into freedom, and the store behind him was silent. Jason stepped into the night air, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. For a moment, he felt nothing but relief. Relief that the oppressive darkness, the store, and the endless torment were finally behind him. His body felt lighter, and his mind, once clouded with fear and doubt, now seemed to clear. The world outside felt like a distant memory, a strange place that seemed foreign and unfamiliar. He walked down the empty street, the distant hum of traffic and city lights flickering in the distance. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement echoed in his ears, and for the first time in what felt like years, he was truly alone. Jason looked up at the night sky. The stars were visible, scattered like diamonds across the expanse of dark. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to be out here, to breathe fresh air and feel the coolness of the world that was not trapped in the store's cold grip. He thought about Alexander, the mysterious man who had helped him escape. Jason wondered if he had truly escaped. The moment he had let go of his humanity, the part of him that kept him tethered to the world, a cold uncertainty had settled in. He didn't know what he had lost, or if he could ever get it back. But at least he was free from the store. Or so, he thought. Jason wandered the streets for what felt like hours. He passed the familiar buildings, the same street signs he had seen countless times before, but nothing felt the same. Everything seemed off. The world around him felt distant, as if he were looking at it through a thick pane of glass. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. Something was wrong. He felt disconnected. He tried to reach for memories, for details of his life before the store, his family, his friends, but they seemed hazy, like fragments of a dream. The harder he tried to hold on to them, the more they slipped through his fingers. The next day, Jason went to the local diner, hoping for some semblance of normality. He sat down at a booth by the window, the quiet buzz of the restaurant around him doing little to ease the unease gnawing at his stomach. He ordered coffee, trying to steady his nerves. The waitress, a young woman with bright eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them, brought over his drink. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with an undertone that made Jason pause. He stared at her, a flicker of recognition brushing against his mind. She seemed familiar, but he couldn't place her face. Her name didn't come to him either. Jason smiled weakly, trying to brush off the growing unease. "Yeah, just tired," he said, his voice hollow. She gave him a concerned look before walking away. Jason looked down at his coffee, swirling it in the cup. He could feel his heart race in his chest, a gnawing sensation that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt present, truly felt alive. And as he sat there, the reality of what he had done hit him. He had sacrificed a part of himself, a part of his soul. But what exactly had he given up? A cold chill ran down his spine as he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't. Remember the details of his life before the store. Faces, names, moments. Everything was slipping away. Jason stood up suddenly, feeling lightheaded, as though the world itself was spinning around him. He stumbled outside, the early morning sunlight blinding him for a moment. The streets were quiet, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. The cars on the road seemed to move too fast. The people walking past him didn't seem real. His heart pounded. He wasn't just disconnected from his past. He was fading. Jason stumbled back toward his apartment, unable to shake the growing feeling that he was being watched. Every corner he turned, every street he walked down, felt wrong, like the store was never really gone. It was still there, lurking at the edge of his mind, in the corners of his vision. The darkness he had escaped from was still following him. As he entered his apartment, the stale air hit him like a slap. His apartment was the same. Nothing had changed. But Jason felt different. He walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the walls, trying to ground himself in reality. But the more he touched, the more he tried to hold on to his memories, the more they slipped away. His apartment, his bed, these things should have been comforting, familiar, but they felt hollow, empty. His reflection in the mirror only deepened the feeling of alienation. What was happening to him? Then, as if summoned by his thoughts. The phone rang. Jason hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" A voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he had heard it before. It was a low, calm voice, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettling about it. "Jason, you've made a mistake." Jason's stomach dropped. "Who is this?" "You know who I am," the voice responded. "I'm part of you, the part you left behind." Jason felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "What do you mean? What do you want?" "It's not over," the voice said, and Jason could hear the faintest echo of laughter in the background. "The store is still with you. The curse doesn't let go so easily." Jason's blood ran cold as he felt the floor beneath him begin to shift, as though it was moving, warping. His apartment began to distort, the walls bending inward, the lights flickering. "What's happening?" Jason shouted, panicked. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt weak, his body unresponsive. The voice on the phone chuckled again. "You thought you escaped, didn't you? But the store never lets go. It's always there, always waiting. You gave up a piece of yourself, Jason, and now it's coming back for you." Jason looked around, the walls of his apartment collapsing. Inward, the very fabric of reality seeming to disintegrate before him. The phone line went dead with a harsh click. Before Jason could react, the floor beneath him cracked open, revealing the same dark abyss that had swallowed him in the store. The cold air of the store rushed back, the whispers growing louder, the shadows stretching out toward him. Jason screamed, reaching out, but his hand was swallowed by the darkness. Jason awoke with a start, gasping for air, his heart racing. He was back in the store, Valley Mart. The shelves loomed around him, and the same cold, oppressive air weighed down on him like a stone. The whispering voices filled his ears, and the darkness pressed in on all sides. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth, the sacrifice. It had never been about escaping. It had been about giving in. Jason had severed part of his soul, yes, but the store had claimed it. It had never left. It had only bided its time, and now it was coming to collect. Jason's body trembled as he stood in the middle of the store, the aisles stretching out before him like a labyrinth of despair. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispers, once distant and muffled, now surrounded him, their voices an incoherent chorus of sorrow and longing. "Jason! Jason!" The sound was like 1,000 voices pressed into one, a relentless hum in his skull that threatened to drive him mad. He stumbled forward, his mind swirling with confusion. His hands reached out, brushing against the cold, lifeless shelves, but they felt wrong, like they weren't real. The very fabric of the store seemed to warp around him, shifting as if it were alive, pulsating with an insidious energy. "Where am I?" Jason muttered, his voice hollow. But the answer was already clear. He was still trapped. Trapped in the store. But now it was worse. Much worse. The store had claimed him in a way that went beyond the physical. He was no longer just a worker. It had taken his memories, his connection to the world outside. The world beyond the store felt like a dream now, a fading echo of something distant and unreachable. Faces blurred in his mind, names evaporated like smoke. He tried to remember the people he cared about, his family, but their faces were nothing more than vague shapes, like ghosts from a past life. His connection to the world outside had been severed completely. The store was all he knew now. Jason's feet moved without his command, his body drawn deeper into the maze of aisles. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shelves towering above, their endless rows of products mocking him with their emptiness. He had no destination, no purpose, only the relentless pull of the store. As Jason wandered through the endless aisles, the sense of detachment grew stronger. He passed familiar sections of the store, the canned goods aisle, the refrigerated section, the towering shelves of snacks. But none of it felt real anymore. The items on the shelves were ghostly, like they had been placed there by a hand he couldn't see. He stopped in front of a display of canned soup, his gaze drifting over the labels. But the words weren't words anymore. They were symbols, abstract, shapes that held no meaning. The color of the cans bled together, blending into a strange, sickly hue. It was as though his eyes no longer saw the world as it was, but as it had been twisted by the store's malevolent force. Jason. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was familiar, yet foreign. His mother's voice, maybe? No, he couldn't remember. He tried to call out, but his throat tightened, his voice stifled by the weight of the store's presence. "Jason," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Jason stumbled forward, reaching out toward the voice, desperate for something, anything to anchor him. But as his fingers grazed the shelves, the voice vanished, leaving only a cold, hollow silence. He turned, looking for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty aisles stretching out in every direction. "Jason, don't. You remember?" The voice came again, this time from the far end of the aisle. Jason's head snapped toward it, his heart racing. He had to find it. He had to understand. But as he walked toward the voice, it moved farther away, retreating like a shadow just out of reach. The aisles twisted and bent, as if the very architecture of the store was playing tricks on him. No matter how fast he moved, the voice only seemed to grow more distant. "Jason!" The voice called again, but it was no longer familiar. It was different, distorted. "Come back to me." Jason felt a chill crawl down his spine, and his legs grew heavy, as though the air itself was thickening. The store had him, and the more he tried to escape, the tighter its grip became. He knew then that he wasn't just losing his memories, he was losing himself, his very humanity. As Jason stumbled deeper into the store's maze, he began to notice the other workers. At first, they appeared as mere shadows at the edges of his vision. But the longer he looked, the clearer they became. They were the faces of the lost souls, those who had been consumed by the store before him. Their eyes were blank, lifeless, empty, husks that wandered aimlessly as though they were on an eternal loop. Some of them seemed to notice him, their eyes briefly flickering with recognition before returning to their vacant stares. Jason reached out to one of them, a man who appeared to be in his late 30s, but the man recoiled, his body jerking back as if in fear. "You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, his voice cracked and dry. Jason tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. The man turned away and continued to shuffle down the aisle, disappearing into the shadows. Jason watched him go, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. "Am I becoming like them?" he thought, a wave of nausea washing over him. "Is this what happens when you give up a part of yourself? You become just another soul lost in the store?" The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with the sound of hundreds of voices, all calling to him, all demanding something. The fear and desperation in their tones were palpable. These were the souls who had been consumed, lost to the curse of the store. And now, Jason was one of them. He could feel it, his mind slipping further, his memories fading like sand through his fingers. There was no escape. He was a part of the store now, and the store would never let him go. Days, or was it weeks, passed. Time no longer had meaning in the store. Jason moved from aisle to aisle, lost in a haze of confusion and despair. His thoughts grew more fragmented. He would sometimes catch glimpses of his reflection in the mirrors near the checkout counters, but the face staring back at him was not his own. It was a stranger's face, pale and gaunt, hollow-eyed and lifeless. At times, he would speak to the other workers, but they never responded. They were too far gone, their minds twisted by the same curse that had claimed him. Jason's own sanity was fraying at the edges. His memories were slipping through his mind like water through a sieve. The world outside the store seemed like a dream, a forgotten life, fading into the darkness. He couldn't remember his family anymore, or what it felt like to be loved. He couldn't even remember why he had come here in the first place. All that mattered now was the store. All that existed was the endless aisles, the suffocating darkness, and the relentless pull of the curse. "Jason," The voice came again, but this time it was no longer distant. It was inside his mind, whispering directly into his thoughts. "You belong to the store now," it said, a voice as cold as ice. "There is no escape. You are ours." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away, his mind unraveling. The shadows stretched out toward him, their cold fingers wrapping around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the heart of the store. He screamed. Once, twice, but no sound came from his lips. The store had claimed him completely. There was no one left to hear. As the days turned into weeks, Jason's transformation became complete. He no longer remembered his name. He no longer remembered who he was. All that was left of him was a shell, a worker in the endless, eternal night shift of Valley Mart. His mind was empty, his soul hollow. But he still heard the whispers, still felt the cold fingers of the store creeping into his thoughts. He knew, somewhere deep inside, that he would never leave, that this was his fate, his punishment. He was just another lost soul, wandering the endless aisles of a cursed place, never to be free again. And so, Jason, who had once been a man, with dreams and hopes, became yet another shadow in the store, his identity swallowed by the dark, just as it had been for so many before him. Years later, the store continued its quiet operation. It had grown, expanding into the surrounding buildings, its shadows spreading further across the city. And one night, a new worker arrived. His name was Alex. He didn't know why he had taken the night shift at Valley Mart. He didn't know why he felt so drawn to it, but as he walked through the aisles, he could feel it. The same coldness, the same pull that Jason had once felt. And as he passed a darkened aisle, he swore he saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching him with hollow, lifeless eyes. A faint whisper echoed in the air. "Welcome to the store." Long before Jason walked through its fluorescent-lit aisles, Valley Mart was not the dark, cursed place it had become. It began as something entirely different, a simple convenience store that promised to serve the needs of the small town it inhabited. Located on the outskirts of a quiet, sleepy neighborhood, Valley Mart was a hub for people in need of late-night snacks, essentials, and most importantly, a sense of connection. It was owned by a man named Richard Warren, a seemingly kind, if somewhat mysterious figure. Richard had a reputation for always being available to his customers, day or night. He had a knack for making people feel welcome, as if they were part of his extended family. But beneath his warm exterior, there was something unsettling. The more you learned about him, the more his story seemed to unravel, like an old book whose pages had been torn and reassembled in the wrong order. He was known to speak in cryptic riddles, and always seemed to be a little too interested in people's personal lives. And as the years went by, those who worked at Valley Mart began to notice strange occurrences. The shelves would rearrange themselves when no one was looking, and the aisles seemed to shift when you weren't paying attention. There were rumors of people who disappeared overnight, workers who had come and gone without a trace, as though the store had swallowed them whole. The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Richard Warren had made a pact with an ancient force, a being older than time itself, one that existed in the space between life and death. This force had taken root in the store, feeding off the emotions and souls of the people who worked there, trapping them in an endless cycle of labor. The store was not just a place of business, it was a prison, and Richard had unknowingly become its warden. The pact had been sealed many years ago when Richard first opened the store. At that time, he was struggling, financially and emotionally. He had lost his wife to a tragic accident, and the grief had consumed him. Desperate for a way to overcome his despair, he had sought out an old fortune-teller who promised him a way to rid himself of his pain. The price? His soul, and the souls of those who worked for him. Richard, in his desperation, had agreed. What he didn't realize was that the store would become a living extension of the entity's will. It would take not only his soul, but the souls of every person who worked there, trapping them in an endless cycle of service, unable to ever truly leave. The store would never let them go. In exchange for his soul, Richard was granted eternal life, but it came at a cost. His body aged slowly, never quite dying, always kept alive by the dark force inhabiting the store. He could live, but he could never truly live. And over time, he began to lose pieces of himself. The warmth, the kindness, the humanity, until all that was left was a hollow shell of a man, tied to the store's unrelenting power. The store itself was not just a building. It was a manifestation of the dark force that had taken root there. It had a consciousness of its own, ancient, malevolent, and constantly evolving. The aisles were its veins, the shelves its arteries. Each worker, each soul that was trapped within, became a part of the store's living ecosystem. Their energy was consumed, and in return, they were kept alive in a state of perpetual servitude. The store's influence was subtle at first. It would begin with small things. A worker would notice a shift in their perception, a slight unease that crept into their bones. But as time passed, the store would gradually take more and more from them. Memories, desires, even their very identity. As they became more entwined with the store, they would slowly lose the ability to distinguish themselves from the building, to understand what was real and what was part of the store's fabric. The whispers in the aisles were the voices of those who had been consumed, those who were no longer fully human, but not yet fully part of the store either. They existed in a state of limbo, caught between worlds. The store fed off their confusion, their longing for escape, growing stronger with each passing soul it absorbed. And then there was the darkness itself, the force that had taken hold of the store. It had no form, no face, but it was always watching, always feeding. Its presence could be felt in the cold air, in the flickering lights, in the subtle shifts in reality. It was patient, waiting for the right moment to claim what was owed to it. The store operated by its own set of rules. Rules that were designed to trap and consume those who worked within. These rules were not written down, not spoken aloud, but they were felt in every fiber of the building. Those who worked there quickly learned them, often without realizing it. The price of entry. To work at Valley Mart, one had to give a piece of themselves. Whether it was a personal memory, a desire, or even their free will, something was always sacrificed. This sacrifice wasn't always immediate, but it would always be taken in the end. Time is fluid. Time in the store does not follow the rules of the outside world. Hours stretch, days blur, and months can pass in the blink of an eye. Those who are trapped inside will lose all sense of time, and eventually they'll forget what it means to exist outside the store's walls. The store is alive. The aisles shift. The shelves move. The store is a living, breathing entity that changes constantly. It reacts to the emotions of its workers, feeding off their fear, their exhaustion, their loneliness. The more fear a worker feels, the more the store grows. The store takes what it wants. Once a soul has been consumed, the store will never let go. The workers who remain will live on, trapped in an endless cycle of labor. Their memories will fade, and they will slowly become part of the store's consciousness. They will cease to be individuals, becoming little more than shadows in the aisles. Escape is an illusion. Those who try to escape will find the store's hold tightening. The doors never lead to the outside world. The more one tries to leave, the more the store will change. The walls will close in, the aisles will twist, and soon the worker will find themselves back at the beginning, forced to serve again. The entity that inhabited the store was not just a force of malevolence. It was an ancient hunger, an unrelenting, consuming force that thrived on the souls of the lost. It existed in the space between worlds, feeding on the energy of those who wandered too far from the light. Its hunger was insatiable, and it was always searching for new souls to claim. The store was merely a vessel for this hunger. The shelves, the aisles, the cold, sterile environment, these were all designed to trap the souls of the living and feed them to the entity. But the hunger was not content to just take the souls. It wanted more. It wanted control, power, and ultimately, it wanted to merge with the world outside. The more souls the store consumed, the stronger the entity became. And one day, if it had enough souls, the store would no longer need to hide in the shadows. It would break through into the world. And when it did, nothing would be able to stop it. As the years passed, the store continued to expand, quietly claiming new victims. The employees came and went, each one leaving a piece of themselves behind, never realizing that the store had already marked them for consumption. For some, the store would remain a dark secret, a place they could never truly leave, even when they thought they had escaped. For others, it would become their grave, their final resting place. And for the few who were lucky enough to make it out, they would be left with nothing but the haunting memories of the store and the knowledge that the entity still waited for them, lurking in the shadows, feeding on the fear of those who crossed its path. But for those who still worked there, the cycle continued. The store was alive, it was hungry, and it would never stop feeding. The store's true nature was not just tied to the material world, it was also intertwined with the spiritual realm, a place where the lines between life and death blurred. This connection was ancient, predating the store's existence, and the entity that inhabited Valley Mart was not merely a malevolent force. It was an ancient being, a spirit, an entity, or perhaps something older and more primal that existed outside of the natural order. Long before the store was built, there had been whispers of strange occurrences in the area. Locals spoke of eerie, unexplainable phenomena, the sudden disappearance of travelers, strange lights flickering in the woods, and a feeling of unease that permeated the land. Some believed it was just superstition, the remnants of old folk tales, passed down through generations. But there was a kernel of truth buried in those stories. The land on which Valley Mart was built was cursed, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. In ancient times, the land had been a site of ritualistic sacrifices, where worshippers of forgotten gods sought power in exchange for their souls. These dark rites had torn open a rift between worlds, a rift that had never fully healed. Parinsi, store, in its original form, was built on this land because it was unknowingly chosen as a place of power, an anchor point for the entity to tether itself to the material world. The entity that haunted Valley Mart was not simply a passive force. It required more than just souls. It needed specific rituals to strengthen itself and to expand its influence. These rituals were subtle, woven into the very fabric of the store's daily operations. Richard Warren, though he had made the original pact, had unwittingly become part of a far larger plan, a dark ritual that would take decades to fully unfold. Rituals themselves were designed to feed the entity in a way that was far more complicated than just draining the souls of its victims. It required the energy of certain emotions: fear, despair, loneliness, guilt, and it thrived on specific acts of ritualistic significance. The layout of the store, for example, was carefully planned, not just for the convenience of the customers, but to guide the workers through particular emotional states. The store was divided into sections that corresponded to different stages of spiritual death. The aisles near the entrance were designed to trigger confusion and anxiety. The middle aisles were filled with products that encouraged memory loss and forgetfulness, and the back aisles, where the most important rituals took place, were constructed in a way that disoriented and trapped the workers mentally, physically, and spiritually. The act of stocking the shelves, performing menial tasks, and following the monotonous routines of the night shift were themselves part of the ritual. The entity fed off the exhaustion, the sense of futility, and the psychological toll these routines took. Workers who were forced to repeat these rituals were unknowingly contributing to the entity's growth. Over time, the entity would absorb the workers' very essence, slowly stripping them of their identity until all that was left was an empty vessel, a body that could no longer distinguish between the self and the store. This transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The workers became part of the entity, like batteries that fueled its expansion. Though the store primarily fed on the souls of its workers, it also had a strange influence on its customers. Those who entered the store late at night, during the hours when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest, were often drawn in by an inexplicable force. They may not have noticed it consciously, but they felt compelled to stay longer than they needed to wander the aisles with a sense of urgency that they couldn't explain. For some, this was just a simple case of late-night cravings, a desire for something they couldn't quite identify. But for others, the store's pull was far stronger. The store, in its twisted form, became an emotional sink, drawing out feelings of guilt, regret, and yearning. People who had unresolved trauma, who were carrying emotional weight from their past, would find themselves strangely compelled to enter Valley Mart, as if it were offering them a chance to confront their inner demons. There were stories of customers who came in for a loaf of bread but never left. Some were found hours later, wandering the aisles in a daze, unable to remember why they had come in the first place. Others vanished altogether, their names never heard again. Some became regulars, returning again and again, pulled into the store's orbit without understanding why. The store didn't necessarily claim their souls in the same way it did with the workers, but it fed off their emotional energy, feeding the entity's insatiable hunger. The more emotionally vulnerable a customer was, the more the store could extract from them. And like the workers, once a customer's energy was drained, they were never quite the same. They would leave the store with a lingering sense of unease, a gnawing emptiness that would follow them long after they had left. As the entity continued to grow stronger, it began to seek out specific individuals, people who could help it cross into the real world. These individuals were often marked by a particular vulnerability, a deep, unresolved need that made them perfect candidates for the store's final transformation. Jason, who had made the fateful choice to accept the curse, was one of these individuals. He had been marked long before he even knew what was happening. He was drawn to Valley Mart not just by the offer of a job, but by the store's influence on his life. A feeling of emptiness that he couldn't shake. The moment he stepped through the doors, he became part of the store's grand design. But Jason was not the only one. The store had its eyes on other potential workers, people who had unresolved trauma, those who were emotionally desperate, those who felt like they had nothing left to lose. Alex, the new worker mentioned earlier, was one such individual. Unbeknownst to him, he was being watched long before he accepted the job at Valley Mart. The store had sensed his loneliness, his brokenness, and had drawn him in like a moth to a flame. The true horror of Valley Mart's existence was revealed in its ultimate goal. The entity was not merely content with feeding on the souls of the trapped workers. Its hunger was a far deeper and more profound need. It sought to merge the spiritual realm with the material one, to tear down the barrier that separated the living from the dead. If it succeeded, the store would no longer be confined to the shadows. The boundaries between life and death would collapse, and the entity would walk freely among the living. The world would become an extension of the store, an endless, suffocating labyrinth of aisles, with the living trapped forever in a cycle of despair and servitude. To achieve this, the entity needed the perfect sacrifice, a worker whose soul was completely consumed, whose essence was fully absorbed into the store's consciousness. This worker would serve as a bridge, a living conduit between the two realms. Once the worker's transformation was complete, the entity would be able to step through the rift, breaking the final barrier. Jason, unknowingly, had been chosen for this role. His transformation had begun, and the store's pull had become stronger with each passing day. He was being prepared for something much darker than he had ever realized. But the story wasn't over yet. There were still others, workers like Alex, who would soon find themselves trapped in the store's grip. And when the final sacrifice was made, the world would change forever. Beyond the entity and its dark rituals, there were other, less understood forces at play. Ancient spirits, long forgotten by history, watched from the edges of the store, caught between their desire to free the trapped souls and their fear of angering the entity that controlled the store. These spirits were the remnants of those who had been consumed by the store long before Richard Warren had opened it. Some of these spirits were benevolent, seeking to guide the workers toward escape, though their power was limited. They existed in the corners of the store, whispering to those who were still aware enough to listen. They were the flickers of light in an otherwise endless darkness. But there were also darker forces, beings that had once been workers themselves, souls that had been twisted and corrupted by the store's power. These spirits sought to maintain the status quo, to prevent anyone from escaping the store's grasp, for they had long since lost any sense of self and had become extensions of the store itself. As the years passed, the entity's hunger grew, insatiable, The souls of the workers and customers, once fleeting, began to contribute more energy than ever before. This was not just because of the quantity of souls, it was the quality. The entity no longer fed on mere survival or fleeting moments of despair. It craved something deeper, something that would bind its influence more tightly to the material world. It began to develop a form of awareness, an ancient sentience that stretched far beyond the physical confines of the store. At first, this awareness was subtle, barely noticeable, a flicker of motion in the corner of a worker's eye, an unsettling sound that didn't quite belong. But as the entity grew stronger, so too did its awareness of the world around it. The store, once simply a vessel for its power, began to transform. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was becoming an extension of the entity's consciousness, a living organism with its own purpose and will. The shelves were no longer static. They seemed to pulse with the entity's growing energy, shifting in subtle ways to influence the people within. The aisles were no longer merely pathways. They were conduits for the entity's dark power, channels that directed the flow of souls and emotional energy. As the entity's strength grew, the store itself began to take on a more organic form. The once sterile environment became more alive. The walls no longer had straight lines. They undulated, as if breathing. The shelves themselves seemed to move when no one was looking, rearranging items in a subtle but deliberate way. Objects would disappear from their designated spots and reappear in strange, unexpected places, as though the store itself was organizing its contents to suit the entity's needs. The air in the store grew heavy with an otherworldly presence. A suffocating weight settled over the workers, making it harder and harder for them to think clearly. The lights flickered constantly, casting eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Sometimes, the store would fall silent, unnaturally silent, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. These moments were brief but intense, and in them, workers could feel the store's presence more acutely than ever. More disturbing, however, was the growing sense that the store could feel its workers. The entity was no longer content to simply consume souls passively. It began to manipulate the emotions of those trapped within. Workers felt watched, scrutinized, judged. It wasn't just the usual exhaustion or fear. It was something deeper, an invasive sensation that penetrated the very core of their being. The store knew them, every secret, every weakness, every desire, and then it would toy with them. If a worker was feeling particularly lonely, the store would make them feel more isolated than ever before. If they were afraid, the store would amplify that fear, creating unsettling noises or strange figures in the shadows. If they felt guilt, the store would exploit it, whispering memories from the past, dredging up long-buried regrets. The entity had learned how to manipulate its prey, feeding not only on their physical energy, but on their psychological and emotional states. As the store grew stronger, its influence began to spill over into the surrounding town. At first, the changes were subtle. People would start to feel inexplicably tired, disconnected from their surroundings. They would pass by the store and glance up, only to feel a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to enter. Some would even claim to have seen strange figures standing at the windows in the dead of night, watching them as they passed. But as the entity's power grew, so too did its reach. The weather in the town began to change. The air became thick and oppressive, and storms seemed to come from nowhere, swirling around the town with unnatural frequency. People started to report odd occurrences, glitches in reality, like time lapses or objects appearing where they shouldn't be. The town, once quiet and idyllic, was slowly being suffocated by the store's growing influence. The entity didn't just want to consume the workers anymore. It wanted to merge the world outside the store with its own twisted reality. It began to bleed into the town, distorting people's perceptions and bending the laws of nature to its will. The physical boundaries of the store began to blur. The aisles extended beyond the store's walls, and strange, half-formed figures began to appear in the streets at night. They were indistinct, their faces shrouded in shadow, but their movements were deliberate, as if they were looking for something, or someone. The more souls the store claimed, the stronger its presence outside the store grew. The town was slowly becoming an extension of the store itself, and soon the store's influence would spread beyond the town, reaching further and further until the entire world was under its sway. To fuel this expansion, the store's rituals became more intense and more frequent. The workers were no longer just performing mundane tasks. They were now part of a ritualistic cycle that fueled the entity's power. In the dead of night, when the store was at its quietest, the workers would find themselves drawn to certain parts of the building, parts they had never consciously noticed before. A particular aisle, a corner in the back, a storage room hidden in plain sight. There, they would engage in strange, almost hypnotic tasks. The items they stocked were no longer simple goods. They were artifacts, each imbued with dark energy. The shelves themselves began to glow faintly with an eerie light, as if the very products on them were charged with power. These rituals were no longer just about stocking shelves or assisting customers. They were about feeding the entity's hunger directly, about enhancing the store's ability to draw in more souls. Each task completed, each action taken, was a step toward merging the physical world with the entity's dark realm. In one particularly haunting ritual, the workers were compelled to move items from one shelf to another, but not in the usual way. They would place an item in its new spot, and then leave it for a moment. When they returned, the item would be gone, replaced by something else, something that didn't belong in the store. A dark, empty box, a shattered object, a small twisted figure made of wax. These objects were not simply misplaced. They were offerings, the physical manifestation of the entity's growing hunger. Each one absorbed a part of the worker's soul, and the more objects they encountered, the more they began to lose their humanity. As the store's power continued to grow, the fabric of time itself began to fracture. Days blended into nights, hours stretched on endlessly, and workers lost track of how long they had been there. What had once been a mundane, regular shift now felt like an eternity. Some workers began to question if they had ever truly left the store. Had they always been part of it? Were they just a figment of the store's consciousness, trapped in an eternal loop? The store had begun to twist the very concept of time, using it as a weapon to break down the workers' wills. They could no longer tell if hours had passed or if days had blended together. Some would swear that it had been weeks, months, years, since they first entered the store, only to have the clock's hands mock them with the same time. The store itself seemed to stand outside the normal rules of time, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing minute. This erosion of time was not just physical, it was psychological. The workers, now trapped in a never-ending cycle, began to lose their sense of self. Their memories of the outside world faded, and their connection to reality became more tenuous with each passing day. They were becoming less and less human, their minds consumed by the store's will. With every passing soul and every ritual completed, the store's presence continued to grow. What was once just a physical building was now a doorway, a portal between worlds. The more souls the store claimed, the more it bled into the real world. The aisles stretched beyond the walls. The shelves began to reshape themselves, bending reality in ways that no longer made sense. The store was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that could bend time, space, and matter to its will. The boundaries between the physical world and the store's dark domain grew thinner and thinner. The store no longer had to rely on the workers to maintain it. It had become self-sustaining, feeding off the souls it had already claimed and using them to fuel its evolution. The store itself was no longer just a vessel for the entity. It was the entity, and then came the final stage of its evolution, the point of no return. The store's influence would no longer be confined to the walls of the building. It would consume the entire world, spreading like an infection, and the world outside would be transformed into a twisted mirror of the store, a world where souls were harvested, time was meaningless, and every moment was an endless loop of despair. The store's transformation has reached its apex. Once an ordinary grocery store, Valley Mart is now something far more sinister. The physical boundaries of the store are no longer confined to the walls. It is a portal to an alternate reality, a dark reflection of the material world, where everything is twisted and broken. The aisles are no longer organized in any recognizable way. The shelves stretch endlessly, and the store's walls pulse with an unnatural, sickly light. The store is alive, breathing with the energy of the souls it has consumed. The store has become a living entity, and its purpose is clear. It is a bridge between the realms of the living and the dead, an anchor that ties both worlds together. Every item on the shelves, every corner of the store, serves a specific function in the entity's grand design. The store's power has reached a critical mass, and it's no longer content with simply feeding on souls. Now, it wants to merge both realities, drawing the living world into its own twisted domain. Jason, Alex, and the other workers have long since been consumed by the store's dark energy. Their bodies may still walk the aisles, but their minds are lost to the entity's influence. They are now nothing more than vessels, empty shells, puppets that obey the store's will. The store has absorbed their essences, twisted their memories, and now their souls are bound to its hunger, serving to fuel the growing rift between the worlds. The entity's hunger has reached a fever pitch, and it requires one final sacrifice to complete its dark ritual. The last worker, the last soul. The workers who have been trapped inside the store for so long, like Jason and Alex, are merely the beginning. The final worker is the one who will be the anchor for the rift between the worlds, the one who will offer their soul completely to allow the entity to cross into the material realm. This final worker is chosen carefully, as the IE store's influence has slowly manipulated their life, feeding off their weaknesses and desires. This worker, whether they are Jason or someone else, has been marked from the moment they stepped into the store. They've been consumed bit by bit, their fears amplified, their guilt twisted, and their emotional energy siphoned to feed the Orbi entity. The worker's final moment is one of utter hopelessness, the culmination of their journey into madness. The store, aware of their every thought and emotion, has designed this moment meticulously. In the final hours before the sacrifice, the worker will experience the full weight of the store's power. Time will stretch into infinity. The walls will close in. Shadows will consume everything. And in the center of it all stands the worker, alone, broken, with no escape. The entity will reach out for the worker's soul, drawing them into its grasp. This moment is not just an act of feeding. It is the point of no return. The worker's soul is the key that will unlock the final stage of the ritual. As the entity consumes them, the worker's consciousness will dissolve, becoming one with the store. The store's boundaries will collapse entirely, and the physical world will begin to fracture. The rift between the realms will tear wide open. The final ritual, once complete, triggers the collapse of reality itself. The boundaries between the material world and the store's dark realm are no longer distinct. they merge, creating a chaotic blend of the two. The store itself becomes a conduit for the merging of the worlds, its aisles stretching into the very fabric of the universe, pulling the living world into its grasp. The town outside the store begins to distort. Buildings and streets warp, losing all coherence. The sky turns an unnatural shade of red, flickering with strange electrical storms that seem to tear apart the laws of nature. Time becomes irrelevant. Hours, days, and years collapse into a single moment, as if the very concept of chronology has shattered. The streets empty of life. The buildings begin to crack and melt, and the very earth itself trembles as if the world is giving way to the store's power. Inside the store, the aisles are now an endless, infinite labyrinth. The walls ripple and change, flickering in and out of existence. The shelves are filled with strange, distorted versions of everyday objects. Foods that twist and warp, transforming into grotesque shapes. Products that no longer make sense, and items that shouldn't exist. The store has become a twisted reflection of reality, where everything familiar is corrupted, distorted, and broken. The souls of the workers and customers who have been consumed by the store are now trapped in this new reality. They wander the aisles, their bodies still functioning, but their minds completely lost. They are caught in an endless cycle of despair, unable to escape the store's influence. They are ghosts, faint echoes of their former selves, locked in a purgatory that stretches on forever. Outside the store, the rest of the world is not spared. The rift between the realms has torn a hole in the fabric of reality. Monsters begin to emerge from the cracks. Creatures made of shadow, twisted by the store's dark influence. They slither through the streets, feeding off the energy of the remaining survivors, dragging them into the store to add to its growing collection of souls. The town becomes a wasteland, a dead zone where the rules of nature no longer apply. Reality itself bends and breaks. There is no escape. In the midst of the chaos, there remains a flicker of hope. A few survivors, those who were unaffected by the store's power or who managed to resist its pull, begin to fight back. These survivors may be the few who have uncovered the truth about the store, those who have discovered the store's ancient origins, its connection to the spiritual realm, and the rituals that have kept it alive for so long. They begin to understand that the only way to stop the entity is to sever the link between the store and the material world, to destroy the rift before it can fully open and merge the two realms. But doing so will require a great sacrifice. The survivors must find a way to reach the heart of the store, to destroy the entity at its core, where the ritual's power is focused. This may mean returning to the deepest, most forbidden areas of the store, places where even the entity fears to tread. However, the store is now a living entity, It has grown too powerful to be easily defeated. Every step the survivors take toward the heart of the store is met with resistance. Walls shifting to block their path, shadows attacking them with terrifying force, illusions that distort reality and cloud their judgment. The survivors are not just fighting the entity, they are fighting the store itself, a sentient being that knows their every move. And as they approach the heart of the store, they realize the horrifying truth. The store is not just trying to merge the realms. It is trying to consume them entirely, to make them part of its dark kingdom. The workers who have been lost to the store, those who have already been consumed, are no longer simply victims. They are extensions of the store, serving as its eyes, its ears, and its enforcers. The survivors must confront these twisted, broken versions of their former colleagues, trapped in a perpetual cycle of torment. The survivors finally reach the heart of the store, a place where the entity's influence is strongest. Here, the boundaries between the living and the dead are almost non-existent. The air is thick with a sense of impending doom. At the center of the heart lies the entity itself, an unknowable, monstrous force that takes the shape of a swirling vortex of darkness and light, a mass of writhing tendrils and shifting shadows. To destroy the store, the survivors must destroy the entity at its core. But doing so will come at a cost. One survivor must make the ultimate sacrifice, offering their own soul to sever the rift between the two realms, to collapse the entity's power and close the portal. This is the final act of defiance, the last chance to stop the entity from fully emerging into the world. As the survivor steps forward to make the sacrifice, they are consumed by the store's power. The very walls of the store tremble as the rift begins to collapse. The workers, the twisted spirits, and the dark creatures that once inhabited the store are pulled back into the void, their souls sucked into the dark abyss. In a blinding flash, the store implodes, its walls crumbling, its aisles collapsing. The entity's power is severed, and the rift between the worlds is closed. For a brief moment, everything goes dark. Silence reigns. When the dust settles, the store is gone. The town is left in ruins, but the rift has closed, and the connection between the living world and the store's dark realm is severed. The survivors, scarred and broken, have a chance to rebuild. But they know the truth. The store was not truly destroyed. It is only sleeping, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul feed on. And somewhere, deep in the ruins of the town, a shadow lingers, watching, waiting. After the store's destruction, the world is left in a fragile state, scarred by the horrors of the past and haunted by the lingering presence of the entity. Though the store has collapsed, the effects of its influence are far from gone. The survivors, broken and deeply changed, must grapple with the consequences of the store's dark reign, even as they begin to rebuild their lives. The town, once a peaceful suburban haven, now lies in ruins. The streets are abandoned, cracked and scorched, as if the very earth had been scorched by the store's malignant presence. Buildings are half-melted, with warped structures sagging at odd angles, as if reality itself had been altered by the entity's power. The once vibrant community is now a ghost town, emptied of life and entirely devoid of hope. For the survivors, the sight is haunting. They step through the desolate streets, unable to shake the eerie feeling that something is watching them, something that survived even the destruction of the store. The town feels alive, though it shouldn't. The air is thick with an unnatural stillness, and shadows stretch longer than they should, as though time itself is frozen. Wherever the survivors go, they feel the weight of the store's dark influence, still hanging over them. Even though the building has crumbled and the rift between realms has closed, the scars of the store's power remain etched into the land. The survivors hear whispers in the wind, distant voices that sound like the lost souls of those consumed by the store. The weather is erratic, storms seemingly out of nowhere, and the shadows seem to move with a mind of their own. The survivors are not untouched by the horrors they endured. Each of them carries the weight of what happened, the lives lost, the dark rituals, and the ultimate sacrifice that saved the world from the entity. But even as they escape the physical collapse of the store, their minds remain shackled by its influence. Jason, the former night shift worker, is now a hollow shell of the person he once was. Though he survived the final ritual, the memories of what he saw, of what he did, are seared into his mind. The faces of his fellow workers, those who had become part of the store's dark machine, haunt him constantly. He relives the rituals, the moments where he was forced to act against his will, and the final vision of the store consuming the last worker's soul. He cannot escape the guilt. The knowledge that he may have been responsible for feeding the entity, that he may have contributed to its power, drives him into fits of delirium. Every night, he hears the store calling him, a low, insistent whisper that promises he will never truly be free. Alex, another survivor, is similarly affected but in a different way. He cannot shake the feeling that he was marked, that the store was always aware of him, always following his every move. He tries to convince himself that the store's destruction was final, that the rift between the worlds is truly closed. But deep down, he fears the entity still watches from the dark corners of the town. The feeling that something is waiting, lurking, gnaws at him incessantly. Other survivors are not as fortunate. They succumb to the weight of their memories, falling into madness and paranoia. Some disappear, lost to the darkness, their minds fractured by the store's long-lasting grip. Others try to rebuild, but they struggle with constant nightmares, waking up in cold sweats to the sound of shelves moving or the rustling of plastic bags in the dead of night. Though the store is destroyed, the entity is not gone. It's not dead. It has merely retreated. The store, as a physical place, has collapsed into nothingness, but the essence of the entity lingers in the very fabric of reality itself. The rift between worlds, though sealed, has left traces, slivers of dark, energy that refuse to dissipate. In the dead of night, strange occurrences begin to happen in the town. A cold wind blows through abandoned houses, carrying with it the faintest scent of stale air and disinfectant, the unmistakable smell of the store. The air grows dense with a palpable dread, and sometimes those few brave enough to venture into the ruins of the old Valley Mart feel an oppressive presence, as if the store's soul still haunts the remains of its foundation. Those who live in the outskirts of the town report strange figures walking the streets in the middle of the night. Ghostly figures with faces too distorted to recognize, their features shifting like shadows. These figures are not quite solid, not quite human. They appear only for a moment before disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie sense of wrongness. The store's influence still reaches out from the depths of the void, trying to reclaim what it lost. It seeks out new victims, lonely, troubled souls who walk near the remnants of the old store, unaware of the force that is still pulling them in. These are not just random wanderers. They are individuals marked by fate, by their own inner turmoil. The entity has learned how to manipulate emotions, to find those who are most susceptible to its call. And in the darkest hours, when the veil between the worlds thins, the entity's whispers can still be heard, promising power, release, and salvation for a price. The survivors are left with two choices: to live in the shadow of their past, haunted by their memories and the lingering presence of the entity, or to leave the town and attempt to rebuild their lives somewhere far from the twisted grip of the store. Some, like Jason, try to fight the memories. He leaves the town, hoping to escape the dark pull of the store, but even as he moves to a new city, the whispers follow him. No matter where he goes, no matter how far he travels, he is haunted by the sounds, the sensations, the memories of that fateful night. Others, like Alex, feel they must stay in the town, confronting the remnants of their past head-on. They search for any trace of the entity's influence, any clue that might reveal how to destroy it once and for all. They dig through the wreckage of the store's remains, looking for hidden messages, symbols, or artifacts that might shed light on the entity's true nature. But they find little, only more signs that the store's grip is still alive. In their search for answers, they uncover dark truths about the entity's origins. It was never just a malevolent force. It was part of something far older, an ancient being that has existed across multiple realms, feeding on fear, souls, and despair. It was always waiting, always lurking in the darkest corners of reality. And it will return. As the survivors continue their journey, they realize the terrifying truth. The store was never the true entity. The store was only a tool, a vessel for something far darker, far more ancient. The entity that plagued them was merely one of its many forms, a part of a vast cosmic force that spans dimensions. This force, ancient and incomprehensible, is not bound by time or space. It exists in the very fabric of reality itself, feeding off the emotions and souls of living beings. The store was just one manifestation, one place where the entity could manifest its power. But it is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. The survivors come to understand that the destruction of the store was only a temporary victory. The rift between the worlds may have closed, but the entity is not gone. It is merely waiting for the next opportunity, for the next soul to feed on. The store was only a chapter in its long, endless existence. The survivors must now face the reality that they are part of a much larger cosmic struggle, one that stretches beyond their understanding. They can never truly escape the entity's influence. It is always there, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The Dita survivors walk away from the ruins, but they know deep down that there is no true escape from what happened. The store may be gone, but its legacy lives on. The entity will return, and when it does, the cycle will repeat. An endless loop of fear, consumption, and destruction. The survivors are left with the haunting realization that they are caught in a battle that transcends their understanding, and there may be no true way to break free. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the store waits for the next soul to wander too close.